Kia ora. Welcome to our conversations with our activist in residence. We are in Race Relations Week. Today is March 22, 2020. This week's theme for us, picking up with the broader conversations that are going on across Aotearoa, New Zealand, is a conversation on racism and particularly looking at decolonizing our futures. Today we are lucky to have with us as our activist in residence joining us through Zoom because of all the changes that are going on right now. Anjum Rahman. Anjum is a celebrated and well-recognized activist for her work with Islamophobia, particularly within the context of the Christchurch attack, but actually really building up to that work since the 1990s. Attending consistently in her activism to the nature of discrimination in New Zealand, to the ways in which discrimination can be addressed, and the strategies both in terms of communities and in policy frameworks in terms of challenging the discriminatory environments that we are in. A little bit about Anjum. And Anjum, I was going to say this when I was reading your bio, that we have, some connections, and it's amazing how the world connects up. We have some connections in the sense that, my ancestors, I think my grandfather's parents were from Allahabad. They had grown up in Allahabad and then migrated to West Bengal. So I see that you have roots in India. You were born in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, and then your father completed a PhD and postdoc in Canada, and then moved to Hamilton. Now, one of the things that is really powerful, I think, about your work is your ability to speak to the question of Islamophobia, which is really a contemporary question in terms of a challenge that we are facing globally, and do so in a way that foregrounds a narrative of love, a narrative of understanding and dialogue. So perhaps we begin there, Anjum, and can we talk a little bit about your childhood and years of growing up and how that shaped your understanding of race, racism and discrimination?
So we moved to New Zealand when I was just under 6 years old, and I guess I don't have much memories of Canada, just sort of, sometimes I don't know if it's memories of the photographs that I've seen or actual real life memories, but I was quite young. And we arrived in New Zealand in 1972 to Hamilton, and we were the first Muslim family to settle here. So it was quite isolating in some ways, I guess, because there were no reference points. There were no other Muslims here, and our close family friends then were Indians. A couple were South Indian, and those were the people that we had most in common with. And the Muslim community was mostly based in Auckland, and at that time petrol was really cheap. So we often every second or third weekend would drive up to Auckland and stay there with family friends and connect with the Muslim community there. And most of the people we connected with were actually Gujarati. So that was the kind of community. I remember a lot of the time in the primary schools that I was at, there were no other Asian kids. It was either Maori or Pakeha. So again, just being very odd, very different, and the children as well treating me as very different. So I think it was a childhood of feeling isolated, feeling confused, feeling like I didn't belong, and particularly in my teenage years, desperately trying to belong. And so that meant somewhat suppressing my identity, trying to do and be things like everyone else. And I remember when I was about 13 and my father sat down one night and had this talk with me to say, you know, you can dress like them, you can talk like them, you can do everything, but you will never be one of them. And, you know, as a 13-year-old, you're like, what does he know? Ha ha. As you do. And I thought, you know, he hasn't even grown up here, he doesn't know what it's like, and I didn't believe him. And it took me, I think, another 20 years to actually believe him, which is a pity, but I understand now what he was trying to say is that I needed to live within my own identity and be comfortable within myself and not try to be someone else just to try and please other people. And when I really accepted that, I think that was huge for me. I think it was really important. I didn't used to wear hijab until I was in my mid-30s. And very often I would dress in skirts and blouses or pants and shirts. And so I didn't dress differently. And like wearing a hijab was a huge step for me. It was a big step to actually stand out and to be different for a person who had always tried to blend into the background. Was a big challenge. And the first week was very harsh. It was so difficult, and I felt self-conscious, I felt awful. And then it was a bit of reflection to think about why I had chosen to do this. And I thought, well, I've chosen to do this because of my faith, because I believe it's right, because I believe in God, and this is what is required. And I thought, well, if that's what I believe, then God will help me. And I think that created a kind of mental relaxation for me, that I was trusting that God would help me. And so therefore I wasn't uptight. And therefore, when I next went out into the world, my interactions with people were from a place of much more peace and confidence. And so their interactions with me then changed and became that as well. So sometimes I think, you know, we create barriers in our mind and they don't come from nowhere. Those barriers came from my childhood. They came from the way I was treated. So they were there. And if we can find a way to let go, then that really helps us settle into our own identity.
Thank you. You know, so one of the things that you bring up in this conversation is this sense of not belonging in childhood. So what contributed to developing that perception?
So it was really very pointed and targeted bullying. So I changed schools partway through primary school, and when I went to my new school, the first week I was really popular. Everyone was playing with me, and they were, you know, it was. I think they just thought I was this most exotic thing, and the kids were friendly. But by the end of the week, no one would talk to me, and I don't believe that I'm a horrible child. I think they must have gone home and talked to their parents and had some feedback from home that led to that isolation. And you know, soon I was getting the taunts of being a curry muncher, of you know, of just being someone that was not part of their world. I also had a really difficult teacher at that time who reinforced the difference and made me stand out in many ways within the classroom, and I believe was really detrimental to my grades to such an extent that my parents had me shifted out of that classroom, because up till then I had been, you know, the top student, and they were really concerned. So I was shifted to another classroom. But of course the reputation goes with you. So the kids still treated me the same. And I think intermediate was really the worst in terms of isolation and in terms of You know, I would get teased for everything, for my clothes, for my big feet, big nose, big, you know, just how ugly I was, all of these. It was just constant bullying.
You know, Anshum, one of the things that, I mean, it's never really surprising, but I guess every time one has these conversations, it is surprising because it seems like, you know, when you listen to these stories, they don't really fit with the broader narrative that constructs New Zealand as a post-racial harmonial space. Yeah, so there seems to be a big gap in that sense. Um, do you see this gap in the way that I'm seeing it?
Absolutely. And I always felt it growing up, particularly towards Maori. And even in my working life, I worked at the university, which was one thing. And then after that, when I went out, I ended up working in rural New Zealand in Te Awamutu, and then came back to work in Hamilton as a chartered accountant. And in both places, like in the tea room, you literally just had to say the word Maori, and these people would just start frothing. Like they would be angry, they would be vicious, they would be um, derogatory in so many ways. And for me, who had studied New Zealand history, who understood the land courts and the various processes by which resources were stripped away, um, all of those things, and the influenza pandemic then, all of those things that had served to really put Maori in a terrible place. Uh, they weren't recognized, they weren't known. Maori were seen as lazy, they're seen as wanting things for free. And it was, to me, that it only just took a few words to bring this racism to the surface was, it was always amazing. Like I never got used to it. So I always knew that hostility was there, and it's often, I mean, for me, it, it hasn't been big things. So I haven't had to deal with, for example, um, physical violence. I know that other women in our community have had to deal with that, and particularly in the last 5 or 6 months, we're getting increased reports of physical violence. Uh, but that's something that I hadn't had to deal with. But um, it was the verbal abuse and harassment and isolation. It was the fact that events weren't organised in a way that worked for me, or the way that I was kept out of certain things. So when I finished at University of Waikato, looking for a job was incredibly difficult, which is why I ended up in rural New Zealand, because no one in Hamilton would have me. But interestingly enough, someone felt comfortable enough to say to me on the phone that they weren't going to be appointing a woman in that role because they'd appointed a woman last time and she had worked out terribly, and therefore no more women. And so when was this? This would have been in mid 1990s. So this myth of what we think we are is not actually what we are. I guess one of the things is that we do comparatively better than a lot of countries. So we don't have sectarian violence. And if we look at what is happening to other countries and their indigenous populations, at least we had the treaty, we had the Waitangi Tribunal, and some of these things that were happening, and compared to other countries which have absolutely nothing. But to me, that then becomes an excuse to not self-reflect and to not take seriously when people are reporting their experiences of discrimination, racism, that it's dismissed because it's not as bad as somewhere else. And to me, that's totally unacceptable. Just because other places are worse doesn't mean what is happening here to people is acceptable in any way.
You know what I really find humbling in this thread, Anjum, is the point where you recognize as a person of color, as a child of migrants, and as someone who practices different faith from the hegemonic faith community, that actually there is a point of connection to be had with the struggles of the indigenous peoples of the land and the experiences of Maori in New Zealand.
I think some of that is, as I said, because I learnt the history. Some of it was definitely around that 1981 Springbok tour. And I just have to laugh at my 14-year-old self, who was very pro tour, who was like, no, sports and politics don't mix, blah, blah, blah. And then a teacher of mine put me on a debate, like we were having a debate, and she put me on the side that was against the tour, because I'd been so vocal about supporting the tour, you see. So she put me on the side against the tour, which meant that I had to then go and read up and research on that. And I have to say that I had been totally ignorant about South Africa. I had no idea. And then I learned about Bantustan, Soweto, apartheid, and what all of that meant. And it was just like mind blown. And it just showed to me how positions can be based, dogmatic positions can be based on a total ignorance of the underlying facts. So that was a huge learning experience, and my heartfelt thanks to that teacher. I can't even remember who it was. But I remember that she did this, and it was just eye-opening for me. Of course, for me as well were the struggles in Palestine. So a different form of colonization and occupation. We did also then do South African history. I did that in fifth form, and learning the way that apartheid had progressed and the way that they had enacted different laws, which was absolutely appalling. And then, of course, we have the Indian history of colonization. So while I would have to say that I'm not clued up on Indian history and politics in any way, I certainly knew enough in terms of the partition, in terms of what that British colonization had meant for a country that was rich in resources, culture, and history, and had ended up being, you know, one of the most impoverished countries in the world because all of those resources had been sucked out. So there were all of these experiences that were international experiences that led into that real identification with what decolonization had meant. What the process of colonization had meant for tangata whenua. And of course, when I did seventh form history, that reinforced even further. And I would really watch with despair the way that the media and opinion writers and the mainstream narratives around Maori were so constantly negative that even now, as I deal with Islamophobia, I would say that Muslims face some of the highest levels of racism or discrimination of any community in this country.
Yes.
But it's still at best at par with Maori. It's certainly not more than what Maori are facing. Yeah.
You know, this is, I find this so touching because, you know, the ethic that you bring to this conversation is an ethic of seeing connections and connecting in solidarity with the ways in which racial violence plays out. And, you know, the thing to me being an Indian migrant, which is so striking, is how often the Indian migrant community holds the same kind of colonial ideology of whiteness that sort of you were referring to in terms of Maori being lazy, Maori taking up welfare or getting land, as if there is no history to that. So I think, you know, finding that connection and placing that at the center is so critical But do you find that to be a challenge at all when working with um, migrant communities and raising that awareness as well?
Absolutely. I think, you know, even though, uh, and I'm saying this as an Indian, even though we managed to, you know, remove British rule, uh, we haven't removed decolonization in our minds. And, you know, just a small anecdote. I remember the first time I went back to India, I was as a 12-year-old, and we actually flew Air India, and we could see the way the Indian air hostesses would treat the white passengers as opposed to how they treated us. And let's remember, none of us were wearing hijab. There was no way it couldn't have been anything other than ethnicity and race, right?
Yeah,
And we see that across the world still, that when Pakeha people go to the Middle East, go to Asia, that their treatment is somewhat different and better than treatment of other nationalities and ethnicities. So in that sense, there is this huge sense of our minds being colonized. Uh, and then coming here and taking on the prevailing narratives. So I think there isn't enough intercultural mixing. So they are not actually having physical interaction with Maori, uh, and they're not in the same spaces, they're not having conversations. So what they get to hear is those same media narratives that I talked about earlier, and they absolutely take those on board. And of course, those media narratives do not give an adequate um, explanation or narrative of the history of colonization in any way. So they don't have that history. What they do have is these very negative, constantly negative perceptions of Maori, and very little social interaction to break those down. Um, on top of that, there are some really prevailing cultural differences that lead into this discrimination. So uh, I think the Pākehā world lives in a very competitive and individual achievement oriented space. And what success looks like is the size of your house, the flashiness of your car, whether your kids go to a private school. That's what you own. What you individually own is the measure of your success. And that is very much, as far as I can see, similar to Asian cultures. Um,
yeah,
when I have visited India, or when I spend a lot of time with Indian people, you know, effectively my own people, um, not everyone, but to a large extent, those kinds of judgments, those
yes.
kind of narratives of success, you know. And I remember having this conversation with a business owner who was holding up to me one of these Indian, I can't remember if it was Tata or someone else, as the epitome of success and what he had achieved. And I was like, I said to him, no, that doesn't count as success in my eyes. He's just accumulated a lot of stuff that doesn't make him successful. And this person being absolutely shocked, and how could I speak such blasphemy, you know? So this is the prevailing culture. Now, with a lot of tribal cultures, and this isn't, I don't think, just for Maori, I think it goes for a lot of Pacifica and very other tribal cultures, their cultural values of success are very much around community and not around individual ownership. So they don't, you know, they would work enough. Like there's this myth that working hard is really good,
Yeah.
and to me it's a capitalist myth. It's a way of making people do two jobs on one salary. You know, to succeed you have to be up at the break of dawn, you have to be working late at night, you work all weekends, you work really really hard, and then you'll be successful. And one day I'm going to write an article about this, but
Yes.
the fact is that working hard, one, is not good for your health to work those levels. It deprives you of your family time, so it's not good for any of your family members, be it parents, children, or spouse. But also, it makes you an awful person, right? Because suddenly you are filled with the sense of moral purity and moral superiority that makes you judgmental, it makes you jealous, and it makes you vicious. and it makes you want to share less because other people haven't worked as hard as you. So why should they get something? Why should they
Yes.
get anything? And to me, that mental impact of working hard is the worst thing. And then you compare it with cultures who don't measure success in terms of how much you own, who live in an environment of sharing everything, of community well-being, and this is where you hear stories. You know, I've heard it from Pakeha who visited Marae, and it was like, I put my lunch in the fridge and next minute it was gone, and this guy was like, oh yeah, I just came and ate it and whatever. And because they're just like, whatever is in the fridge is communal property. It's just a very
Yes.
different culture, right? And that at another time they will make something that you will eat, and so they won't think anything of it.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, then the interpretation is, oh, these people are lazy because they won't work hard. Well, actually, no, they probably have a better outlook on life because they will want to work enough, right? And then
Yes.
you spend your time on other things, and leisure time has value.
Yeah.
As people are now going to realize when they have a lot of it, how to make value out of your leisure time. But I think that is also a source of where this being judgmental and where this discrimination against Indigenous people and Pacifica people that a lot of Asians and Pakeha have, it is really coming from this very much a cultural clash that comes from, to me, the source of it is this capitalist ideal of having to work hard to succeed, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and all of these narratives, and to me, false narratives of success.
Right. And that in itself is the colonizing narrative, right? It's the narrative of the colonizer.
Yes, yes. As they want to get work out of
Yes.
native populations and often enslaving them, indentured labor, or just ways that they can get work out of people with paying the most minimal amount possible. And which is hilarious when now you have these questions around, why do they want to come to Western countries? Why can't they stay in their own countries? Because Western success is built on land theft and slavery, right?
Yes.
And why are they coming? It's to gain their lost wealth.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that is, to me, as valid a reason as any other reason. And at least they're coming through legal immigration procedures, and they're getting jobs, and they're doing, you know, they are not doing the things that were done to them. And even then, they're treated as somehow wrong or bad or evil.
Right. So what's really powerful in this narrative of anti-racism is the centering of decolonization in the conversation. Right. I want to rewind a little bit, Anjum, and talk about, you remember you shared that at one point of time, your dad had said to you that, no matter what you do, you would never be one of them, and that through a journey that you went through, you sort of came to realize that, and you came to that owning of your identity or selfhood. What was that journey like?
So, yeah, it's interesting looking where I am now, because I was the person in my 20s that if I had to go into a room of people that I didn't know, my hands would literally be shaking. I was that distressed, socially very lacking of confidence, didn't know how to start conversations and hold them. I think all of those things that I think back and thinking the worst of myself, and always and consistently thinking I was a failure, and those messages I was getting externally from a variety of sources were confirming to me that I was in fact a failure, even though I was a good chartered accountant, I had my own house, I had cars, like by every measure of success that we just discussed before. I was living the middle class life. But inside, that I just felt terrible. I think to me, um, what really changed for me was the attacks on 911 in America. And at that time, there was just suddenly this huge negative spotlight placed on the Muslim community. Up until that time, the discrimination that I faced, and of course I wasn't wearing hijab, was definitely race-based and color-based, because people didn't know what Muslim was. Ramadan, huh, what's that? Muslim? That Islam? It was just like in New Zealand, generally people just didn't know. And suddenly everybody wanted to know who these awful people were and why they could behave like that. And of course, the prevailing narrative that came out of the US and through the West was that it was because of their religion, that this is what they believed, this was their jihad, this was an essential part of being Muslim. And we had to then go through a few years of that narrative being consistently put out through media and other sources. Again, that was the tea room conversation. People were too polite to say it in front of me, but I knew that that was the narrative that was there. And actually, I put on my hijab around 6 weeks after 911. It was more of a personal reason, so it wasn't so much about what was going on in the world, but that I had been able to articulate, because I had felt pressure to put on hijab and I'd always resisted it for at least 10 years. I was just like, no, not going to do it, because of that sheer bloody mindedness that humans have, that when someone tells you to do something, oh well, that's the thing you're not going to do. We get it when we're 2 years old and we continue and that behavior all through our adult lives. But I think I had been able to articulate that if I put on a hijab, it would be for my own reasons and my own beliefs, and that it would never be because someone else thought I should do it. And that had been accepted. And once I'd articulated that, the pressure came off and I could make a decision free from any expectations of everyone else. Then I decided to do it. And as I said, the initial week was really difficult. But after I had come into that space of peace and calm, I have never considered taking it off. Even with the stories of violence, even with the harassment and all of those other things, I just started to become much more comfortable in myself. And all of that lack of confidence and all of the feelings of failure certainly didn't go away. They were definitely there with me. In 2003, I think it was 2003, I ended up getting divorced, and then I jumped into politics. So I ended up joining the Labour Party, and I ended up standing for the list in 2005, and I stood again in 2008 and
2014 was it?
Yeah. So politics, why did I get into politics? At that time, New Zealand First and Winston Peters, their whole shtick for getting into Parliament was a very strong anti-Asian stance. Excuse me. And with the rise in MMP and the ability to get votes across the country rather than just in a particular electorate, changed the way that politics was done. And a way for them to get attention was to go out hard and to go out negative and to be very outrageous. And that was having an impact. In the mid-1990s and the late 1990s was incredibly hostile for Asians in New Zealand. For anyone who was there, they will remember that period. I remember having an Omani boarder living with me, and at University of Waikato, Hillcrest Road, there's a main zebra crossing that everyone in Hamilton will be aware of, and she was crossing that, and someone drove a car directly at her to intimidate her. I mean, they weren't going to run her over, but they just went hard towards her to create fear. And she just came home shaking and so upset. We were getting stories of international students who would be stopped by Pākehā and asked where they were from, and then told to, I expect I can't swear in this, but told to F off back to their own country. It was like there were just so many instances, and people were living in fear. And for me, hitting 2003, the anti-Asian stuff was turning into anti-Muslim stuff specifically, and politics for me was a way to try and get a voice to counter New Zealand First. It was a way to try and get some media presence, or to get some kind of profile so that I could speak back to the hate that was happening. And in that sense, it worked very well, because in the 2005 campaign, I ended up on Close Up debating Winston Peters and being the first Asian person to speak back to him in person. Well, actually, he was sitting in a, excuse me, he was sitting in an airport terminal at Auckland Airport, and I was in the studio, but still. And then the next morning, getting to do the same on Morning Report, and actually pushing back on his narrative, and in the Morning Report interview, leaving him at a loss for words. Like, he literally couldn't think of what to say in response. That was one of the worst things I ever did. Like, it was awful to have to do it, but it was incredibly valuable, and it was so important. But the decision to go into politics, of course, didn't help with those feelings of inadequacy and those feelings of failure. In fact, it exacerbated it. And all the time, you know, I knew I was never successful. I didn't do well on the list. I didn't do well at politics. I think that there was a real concern or unwillingness to put a Muslim woman in a hijab into Parliament, possibly, and very likely there was also a strong concern that I would not be able to deal with the negativity that would come and be directed towards me as an MP. And now that I look at what Gauri's government has gone through, and knowing my own fragility, they were probably right in that regard. But it deprived me of that ability to have a greater voice. And it's certainly really, really knocked my confidence a lot. I also stood up for City Council in 2013, and that was much better in terms of the experience of campaigning, a lot more positive, but losing was really, really hard. That knocked me back a lot. So yeah, and I remember during that campaign, oh my gosh, you know, having to do things that were really, really challenging for me. So I had done a lot of door knocking. Central government politics, I gave me, you know, I don't regret that time. One, I was on policy council, I was, you know, I was regional chair. In terms of the party structure, I was quite successful locally in my region. I had a lot of support, and I learned so much. And I would never regret it for an instant. And I learned how to door knock. But of course, in that door knocking, I was promoting not myself, I was promoting a party. But with city council elections, I had to door knock to promote myself. And that was really hard. I always went with someone, and I always generally went with a white person. And this is how, you know, when they say level playing field and being chosen on merit, how much of nonsense that is. So I would go with a Pākehā person. We would stand at the door and knock at the door. The person would open the door. I'd have my flyer with my photograph on it, right? And I would offer the flyer, and I would say, hi, my name is Anjum, I'm standing for council. And the person would look at me, and then they'd turn to the Pākehā person and answer to them. And then I would say something else. Or if the Pākehā person happened to answer, then that was that. The conversation happened there. If the Pākehā person didn't answer and I would say something else, they would listen to me, look at me, and then turn to the Pākehā person and respond to them. And it was only the third time, and if the Pākehā person didn't respond, that they were like, okay, I actually have to talk to this person, that they responded to me. And to the extent that one of my friends made the point of standing 5 meters back. If there were steps up to the porch, she would stay at the bottom of the steps, like to try and force people to talk to me. And every single person who went door knocking with me had that experience. They all agreed with that experience. One day, I made the mistake of going door knocking with a brown woman. So there was two of us. And she would still say to this day that that was one of the worst experiences she's had. And I feel really bad for putting her through that. We got doors slammed in our faces. I was yelled at to get off the property. People just refused to engage, would not talk to us. And it was incredibly negative. So to say that we as people of colour campaigning have a level playing field, and if we don't get in, it's because of merit, I can categorically say that that isn't true. And the hardest thing was that I couldn't even raise this as an issue, because if I talked about in any way publicly the fact that I was getting a negative response, then people wouldn't vote for me, because people are not going to waste their vote on someone they think won't get in, right? So you have to look like you're going to get in, and you have to look popular. And so I couldn't even speak to these kinds of issues. I remember being outside Kmart and my friends were sign waving. We had a team there and I was handing out leaflets. We were on the footpath because there's a night market that happens on a Saturday night. So we had targeted that we would stand out on the street and just create some publicity for me. So one of my friends was waving a sign with my name on it, and this woman walked past with her family and pointed at the sign and said, "I'm not voting for that." And so, you know, of course, the person herself holding the sign was totally taken aback. I was more used to this kind of thing. So I stepped forward and offered my leaflet and said, "Oh, thank you. Hi, I'm Anjum." And she was just like, "Go back to your own country." And I was like, "I'm in my own country. This is my country." "No, it's not." And I said, "Yes, it is. And I have the passport to prove it." And she didn't have anything to say to that. And she hadn't stopped walking through this interaction. And she just gave me the dirtiest look she could, because she was a few meters away by now, and carried on. And she had children with her. They looked like teenage kids. And I just felt so bad for them. But I know that other candidates get abused and they get negativity, but at least they get it for their political platform, right? This was just an attack on me and my identity. Like, she didn't actually even know, I bet, what any of my policies were. So, you know, and I have been, you know, in terms of political experiences, I was specifically asked by a chair I was invited to their house and I was asked to remove my hijab, and didn't I know that it wasn't a requirement of Islam and that I didn't have to wear it and that I should take it off. I asked a minister the question that would I succeed more on the list if I took off my headscarf, and he said, and he was, you know, he was nice enough to be honest with me. I had a really good relationship with this person who was generally really supportive, and he said, "I have to be honest with you, yes, it would." So, you know, there was every indication that identity and my identity was a barrier to my success. And all of those things, as I said, just fell really fell into that narrative that I already had going in my head, that I wasn't good enough, that I was a failure as a person, that I would never succeed, that I didn't belong. And even so, as I said, regionally, I had a lot of support. So at the same time, I had a lot of people that were really positive towards me. But because of the self-narratives, you just absorb all the negative stuff. Or I did. That's how I was. I absorbed all the negative stuff. And it was just, yeah. I guess I think the one thing that I feel proud of myself about is that I never gave up, and I never let that keep me at home. So I've stopped politics. I don't do politics anymore because I believe I can be more effective outside of politics. But I didn't let that be an excuse to stop being involved in the community, to stop doing the things that I was doing, continuing with my own journey of self-development. And as I said, I've had a lot of positive experiences. I was supported to go on the Leadership New Zealand Trust course, and that was an amazing experience for me. I've often gone to counselling when I've needed it, and looked after my mental health. I think that's really an important part of the journey to keep going. And going to friends and talking about how I feel is also important, to get, often we need external validation. I needed it, so I sought it and I got it. But where I am now, I think, is very much beyond that. And I've finally, turning 50, and in my 50s, I finally feel like I'm in a place where I feel my own sense of self-worth, that it's there, it's inside me, and I don't need validation from other people to know that I'm a valuable person just in and of myself. I think with the Leadership New Zealand course, one of the biggest, most important messages that I received personally was to be kind to myself. And that was such a foreign concept to me. Like, it just had not occurred to me that I can show kindness to others, and that I had totally failed to show kindness to myself. And that was a commitment during that year as I did to that course. I remember sitting in Waiheke Island at one of the sessions and making that commitment to myself that I would be kind to myself. And it is such a valuable thing to do. And a test that I ran at a Islamic Women's Council conference, because I picked it up from a Facebook meme, which is quite hilarious. So I was at the conference and I said, okay, my sisters in Islam, I want you to, for the next 30 seconds, write down a list of 10 things that you love. And they can be people, they can be concepts, they can be anything that you like, they can be objects. Just write down a list of 10 things that you love. So I gave them the 10 seconds. There would have been at least well over 100 people in the room, possibly up to 150. And then I said to them, hands up the people who have put themselves on that list. And two women put their hands up. And for the rest of them, and myself, when I read the meme, which was basically on a list of the things that you love, where would you place yourself? And when I read that, again, it was like the kindness thing, like mind blown. Like, I would not have put myself on that list. It wouldn't have occurred to me to put myself on that list. But that self-love is one of the biggest gifts that we can give to other people, actually, because so much of the friction and the negativity and even the discrimination and hate comes from a place of a lack of confidence, a lack of feeling good about ourselves, and so we lash out to other people. And one of the ways that we make ourselves feel better is by trying to position other people as lower than ourselves. And a lot of discrimination is on that basis. And you'll find, you know, when you look at, say, American history and other places, that it is poor whites who are the greatest, who were the greatest discriminators, because in order for them to feel any kind of self-worth, they needed to see a group of people that was lower. So learning to love yourself is a gift to the people around you, with the corollary that self-love doesn't mean thinking that you're better than anyone else, right? Self-love means that you love who you are while remembering that everyone else has equal value to yourself. And I think if that's a thing that we could teach to children and adults alike, in terms of decolonization, I think that would be one of the biggest gifts that we can give to people. Yeah.
To love the self and to extend that love to others from that place of loving the self, huh?
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. You know, one of the things, Anjum, as I was hearing you speak, and I was thinking, you know, geez, you know, here's someone who is so accomplished in terms of all the changes you have brought about within this space of New Zealand. You know, you were a founding member of the New Zealand Islamic Women's Council, founding member of the Hamilton Ethnic Women's Centre. In response to the Christchurch mosque shootings, you sort of played a key role in establishing the inclusive Aotearoa collective. You were, appointed as a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for your service to ethnic communities and women. And last year in 2019, you were shortlisted for the New Zealander of the Year award. So these are major accomplishments. And you know what is really beautiful is to see someone who sort of has played such a visionary role in terms of really impacting this landscape, particularly in terms of issues of racism and discrimination, and at the same time have so much humility, you know?
So in terms of humility, I think a lot of the things that I did, you know, in Islam, we have this thing of that, like the first hadith, and I think it's Sahih Bukhari, is al-amal bin niyat, that deeds by their intentions. In other words, that it isn't enough that you do a good thing, you have to have the right intention as well to do it for the right reasons. And a lot of the things that I did were not for an altruistic reason, and I'm very, very clear in myself about that. It was because I didn't feel valuable. I was seeking my value by trying to do things in other spaces to try and prove to myself that I was worth something. And so it wasn't generally an outward-looking altruistic mode of being. And so that's why, you know, and I always be very honest to myself about that, and remind myself that, you know, okay, I did all those things, but I know what my reasons were for. And also, I never did anything alone. Like, there's not a single thing that I did that is my personal accomplishment. We worked in groups of people, right? Whether it was Shama, Hamilton Ethnic Women's Centre, whether it was Islamic Women's Council, whether it's Interfaith, whatever I did with other people, and oftentimes those people were taking more of a lead than me. Sometimes they weren't, or they were supporting me, whatever it was. Like, it's not an individual achievement. And so that is really important to remember. And I always feel sad for people who think of themselves as self-made and who think of themselves as, I did it myself. It goes back to that I worked really hard narrative and I achieved this and it's all me. It's never all you. And I think those are important. In terms of the awards and honours, I don't know to this day who decided on the New Zealand Order of Merit. I have no idea who nominated me for Kiwibank New Zealander of the Year. I've heard that there were more than one person, and I thank them sincerely. I quite seriously thought about not taking the New Zealand Order of Merit. I think partly it was, I'm totally anti-royalist, you know, that whole system, you know, and it felt like a real sellout to take it. But also knowing that that had come from the fact that a lot of the stuff that I had done post 15th of March was visible because I was a media spokesperson. That's a role that I had built up over, you know, from back in 2003 to 2004. And so I was able to step into it when a tragedy happened. But that the real work was being done by the people who went to Christchurch. I didn't even go to Christchurch. And there were the people who were washing the bodies, who were burying the dead, who were cleaning up, who were visiting the sick and comforting, who were putting structures of support in place and working with that community. I didn't do any of that. And those are the people who should have been honored, but they weren't visible. So for me, it felt like I was taking something that belonged to someone else. And in the end, I took it for a couple of reasons. First of all, that I was getting the message from people that if I, you know, my taking the honor made them felt seen. So it was, in a sense, taking it on behalf of Muslim women, on behalf of the community, to give visibility to the community. And secondly, because I was starting this project, this Inclusive Aotearoa Collective Tāhono, and it is a huge project, that it would give some credibility to the project, and which was needed at that point. And so if I could personally give that to the project, then this was something that I needed to do. So for those reasons, I actually, you know, pushed down my personal principles, stepped on them basically, and accepted the award. And it felt similar with the Kiwi Bank Award. And also the third reason was to honour the people, whoever they are, and I still don't know who they are, but to honour their wish to see me accept an honour. And I felt that, you know, if someone had come to me and I'd been able to sit with them and explain my reasons, and not accepted, that would have been one thing, but I didn't have that opportunity, and I didn't want to disrespect their feelings. So also I did accept these things, but they don't, you know, for me, they don't at all determine who I am, and I don't let it affect what I do. I think the only thing I really use the MNZM for is when a friend of mine wanted to get a reference letter for her son because he wanted to get a rental property, and I thought, oh yes, whoever this landlady will be may be influenced, so this is a time for me to use my honour. So I put it in the letter, just add weight so that it could get their rental property. But generally for me, they are appreciated, the sentiment behind them is appreciated, but it doesn't form part of who I am or how I think or how I function.
You know, one thing that again, you know, I'm really enjoying how you're turning these narratives on their head. And one of the things that you're doing right now is sort of also showcasing how sort of the individual can be placed within the broader context of the collective struggle, you know, and sort of one places one's privilege in relationship to that struggle. Anjum, you know, one of the things I would like to do as we move toward wrapping up is really engage with you with the question of Islamophobia, because as you said, being Muslim and being a Muslim woman, and we see this in our own work on experiences of racism across New Zealand, is that some of the strongest aspects of racism are felt by Muslims, and often by Muslim women, you know, in terms of, you know, all the way from being abused because of the hijab to the hijab being pulled, to being spit on, you know, the kinds of experiences one just wouldn't think happens in New Zealand, you know, because these are the things that one says it happens in Trump's America, not in kind and loving New Zealand. So Do you want to sort of um, uh, share with us a little bit in terms of what you have found in your own experiences as well as in your work?
Yeah, so I'm just thinking that I'm actually about to do a webinar around Islamophobia. So I'm going to refer people to the webinar about more detailed aspects around that. For me, Islamophobia sits in a global context, and particularly with 911, certainly before that, it definitely was there. You know, we can go back to the Crusades and further back to the conquering of Jerusalem and the pushing back of the Romans by Arabs and so on. That sort of clash has always been there, but particularly since 911, we saw the war on terror. So some things had happened. So the communist threat had kind of died with Russia, you know, moving away from communism. The wall went down in Germany. All of those things happened, and so now we didn't have a communist threat for the military-industrial complex to coalesce around. And what 911 did was provide a new threat, which was the Muslim threat and Islamic terrorism and jihadis and all of these things. And so it became a geopolitical narrative to justify a war in Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, an illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq. And then it became the prevailing narrative to put Muslims in the place of a danger to civilization. We had the whole clash of civilizations thing. So this Islamophobia, the current wave, isn't like the source of it isn't an individual racism aspect. It is part of a geopolitical narrative that New Zealanders have taken on board. And many countries have taken on board. I mean,
Yeah.
we can see what's happening in India.
Talk about India.
Yeah. And India is a prime example of using a Muslim population as an existential threat to gain political power. Whether, you know, it's the use of the Babri Masjid or whatever other narratives, the use of Mughals as being everything that is wrong in India and no recognition of what they brought to the country. All of these things are part of creating that existential threat that the current regime then places itself as the protectors of that threat and rides into power. That has worked across the centuries. It has worked across all populations. And we are it. We are, since 2001, the existential threat to all of civilization. And so that is how we are talked about, that is how we are viewed, that is how we are described, and that is the root of Islamophobia. And so part of that is the stereotyping. So whatever is done by some people is extrapolated, and the reasons for it are based then in the religious belief. So as for you know, well over a decade, any right-wing or white supremacist terrorism is treated as lone wolves with mental health issues, and not as part of a prevailing culture or narrative or belief system. The opposite is the truth for any bad thing done by a Muslim person, is that it is not cited within the individual, it is cited in terms of their faith and religious belief. So that is how Islamophobia plays out, and because this narrative is so well funded, it's so well organized, it is really, really difficult to push back against. It's very hard, and it's very hard to do so individually and as an individual effort. And of course, you know, Muslims across the world themselves are very fractured. It's not some kind of, you know, even though it's presented as a very united threat and all Muslims are presented as a united threat, Muslims themselves are a very fractured community, and it's because there's multiple ethnicities, and as with all belief systems, there are various interpretations. I mean, even if you take Hinduism, there's so many different ways of being Hindu, so many different practices from all across India that are very differing. And the same with Christianity, is most well known for its various sects of Protestant and Catholic, and then, you know, Methodist, Baptist, whatever, to your Seventh-day Adventists and so on. So Islam is the same. And as with each religion, every tenet is up for debate. I think the only thing that all Muslims would agree on is that there is one God, right? And they would all agree that that Prophet Muhammad is there, and that we follow his teachings. But then after that, you know, you get the Shias who then follow Ali radiallahu anhu, and then we get Ahmadiyas, Qadianis, and Agha and whatever. So even at that top level of belief, you start getting the differences from right at the top. So then, given that we're fractured, having this coordinated response against this very organized threat against us has been really difficult. And I think, in a sense, it's good. I wouldn't want us to just all be like one thing or one person. Like, there's beauty in diversity, you know, and I would hate to think that we move into some kind of authoritarian, centralized system where only one small group of people speaks for the whole. To me, that's not an answer, and that's not an acceptable solution to this kind of hate. But we do need collective action, and we do need solidarity. And I think bringing it back to the whole decolonization discussion we're having, that is where connections between different communities and different people who are committed to this work is really, really important. And for all the negativity, there are a lot of people that want to make positive change. And I think that one of the things that hate does, and that this really organized hate that we're seeing online and offline, what it does is make us believe that everyone else thinks differently to us, and that there's not that many of us who think like this. And so we don't reach out. The truth is actually the opposite, that there are a lot of people that want to fight against hate. And so what I would encourage is for people to go looking for the other people who want to fight hate, because we need the collective. We need people to be working together. So go out and find your people who will be sitting in solidarity with you, because they are definitely there. I've been finding a lot of them, and they're amazing, and people who are doing big and small things within their own communities. And the last thing I would say is that no effort is wasted. Even a one-on-one conversation, you don't have to do big things. You don't have to do grand things. You do what you can where you are. Which is how I see my own actions is, you know, I can't go and change, for example, FGM in Northern Africa. Not there, that's not my space. I'm here. God put me here, in this country, in this place, and so my role is to be active here, to make things better here, and fight the battles that I can fight effectively. Yeah.
So really identify what are the spaces where you can make change, and do it.
Yep. Reach out is the best thing. Reach out to other people and work together.
Lovely.
Yep.
Sort of as we wrap this up, Anjum, I want to come back to your sort of beginning journey. And what to me is so powerful in this narrative is your ability to get up, you know, and say, okay, this is sort of one point, and I'm going to move from it and see how I participate in the next process. Sort of the incredible resilience across spaces that you have created for yourself, but also for the communities that you're building and working with. So how do you draw that ability to stand back up and push?
I think so. I'm just trying to think about how I can say this while respecting the confidentiality in the lives of other people. But I went through a very dark phase of my life between around 2001 and 2003, and what was a very, very difficult time for me. And while it was absolutely awful to be going through, that time is now my source of resilience. So very often when things are really bad, I say to myself, you got through that and you know you can survive. You know you're a survivor. You got through that and this is not as bad as that was, right? And you survived that, which means therefore that you can survive this. And I truly, honestly believe that if you believe in God, or if you believe in fate or nature or whatever you believe in, that these bad things are sent to us as a gift, that we should see difficult times as a gift. Which is not to say, you know, feel your emotions, be sad, be angry, cry, do all the things that you need to do in difficult times. Don't suppress your emotions in any way, but remember in your mind that these bad times are a gift because they help to make you stronger for the next thing that comes along. And always remembering that bad times don't last forever. They might last for quite a while. That's the reality. And in that time, just remembering to hang on and make it through each day, and just planning each day, just get through each day. And I know this is important for where a lot of people are right now, with losing jobs, with being isolated in homes, and we don't know how long this pandemic is going to last. Is just live day to day, get through it, and never lose hope that there will be an end, because there is an end. And then you look back at that difficult time and use it as your strength, because that's how it's worked for me. That's how I pick myself back up, is reminding myself that I'm still here. Even after all this difficult stuff that happened, I'm still here, I'm still functioning, and yeah, and I still, you know, the last time I went to counselling was I think April last year, to deal with what I was going through after 15th of March. When, you know, you can feel, I mean, I can feel that I'm starting to slide, that things aren't okay, I'm not coping, you know, right? That's a GP appointment, time to get some counselling. It's not a failure to get help in any way. If you need help, 1737, don't be afraid to call, don't be afraid to ask. Yeah, that is a huge part of resilience as well, is knowing when you're at your lowest and you need some support now. Yeah, then do it. Get it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anjum, for this conversation. We look forward to learning from you later this afternoon with the webinar, as well as your conversation with CARE. Again, thank you for inspiring us and for offering all these lessons. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. Lovely to be talking to you.